Had some scrap sticks of lumber, some beech and some black walnut, and I thought I'd make a short video on making a small cutting board. To make a couple of, I would say, compact cutting boards, I had some black walnut, as I said. The beech was 5/4 stock. In fact, it was a little bit bigger. It was almost 1 1/16. So I ripped this 1/2 inch black walnut to a little over 1 inch in width to make some stripes that would contrast nicely with the whiteness of the beech. And having cut the walnut, then I started cutting some beech strips I had to make a center stripe, again down to a little over 1 inch in width. And then I got the 5/4 scrap that I had and ripped it as well into 2 larger boards for each end or each side of the cutting board. And you'll see that final shape or pattern in a moment as I do the glue up. So once I had ripped all these boards and cleaned up their cut edges as well as I could, I went over to a pair of pipe clamps. These are 3/4 inch pipe clamps too, by the way. I really prefer these over the 1/2 inch size because they don't flex at all. So I used some water resistant Titebond Type 3 to glue these up, since they will probably get wet during their lifetime. And basically I just glued up the stripes, a large piece of beech, a 1/2 inch piece of black walnut, about a 1/2 inch piece of beech again down the middle, another 1/2 inch piece of black walnut, and then the other large piece of beech. And once I had clamped up this sandwich of the first board, I just repeated that all again, clamped the boards back to back with no glue between them. And so when they came out of the clamps, it was 2 separate glue ups. Ran the edge or the ends kind of ragged because I was going to chop these off later on the miter saw, and as long as they were longer than my final length, that's really all that mattered. I glued these up pretty quickly, spreading the glue with a glue brush, and just knocked this out rather quickly. There was a ton of squeeze out, but you'll see in a minute I dealt with that with a card scraper, and that took care of it very well. What I wanted to end up with once this glue up was done was a flat enough surface to run through the planer, at least one surface flat. Then that would cause the second surface to be flat. Then you could flip it over and have a reliable flat surface for the final planing. Long story short, you get a nice parallel flat plane job if you can start with one side of this glue up, not lumpy and bumpy with either squeeze out or boards that you had askew sticking out either high or low in the glue up. I tend to just kind of tap these down against the flat bar of the pipe clamp. Again, the 3/4 inch clamp kind of helps that because they're very, very rigid and very, very straight. And I was pretty happy with this glue up. I wiped the squeeze out off of the top, you can see, and I let this thing dry. These scraps of beech were from another project. That's why there's some finish on there. But that's all going to come off in the planer here in just 2 seconds. So I came out with a nice board, about 10, maybe 11 inches long and about 5 inches wide. And we'll end up with a nice stripe look because the beech is so white and the walnut is so dark, it makes for a really great contrast. I found that a card scraper works great to take off squeeze out. And I just kept running this over the squeeze out and then running my hand over those surfaces to make sure I had something that was flat. I laid that down then on a flat table after I was done with the scraper, just to make sure that the board wouldn't rock, because you don't want it rocking in the planer. You want it to slide through the planer flat so that you can come out with a trustworthy flat side on the top. Then again, that becomes your flat side on the bottom on the final pass through the planer. So just a few passes with this card scraper on both sides, or on one side of each glue up, was sufficient to get me a nice flat surface to run through the planer. My planer is, I keep it in a drawer, so to speak, in my workbench, and it kind of all comes apart and folds up very nicely and slides into the drawer nicely. And so after adjusting the height of the cut, hooking up my vacuum system, I made the first pass. All that did on that first pass was just take the high edges off of the black walnut down the middle. It took several passes, and honestly, the finish that was on these boards kind of helped to spotlight the places that were still high and low on these passes through the planer. Once I'd done this 2 or 3 times on that front side, I flipped the boards over, planed the other side. We had a fairly new planer blade in the planer, and so these surfaces came out just kind of glassy smooth and dead level, and they looked really nice, again contrasting the walnut against the beech. Flipped those over, ran them through the other side, and ended up with boards that were right at an inch, maybe a heavy 15/16, a nice chunky block in your hand when you're using it as a cutting board. I have a brand new blade in my chop saw, so when I cut the ends off, I put a little bit of blue painter's tape on the trailing edge just to prevent tear out. But this blade is so sharp, it really does a very nice job of cutting a nice flat cut against the grain, no tear out, and a very trustworthy cut that just took a little bit of light sanding to give me a good butt end on each side of the cutting board. Once I'd cut those, I just cleaned up the table saw marks in the rips. As I ripped these boards to final width, they left a few table saw marks, and so I just took my trusty number 3 Stanley smoother out and made a few passes on the long grain sides of these boards and got the blade marks out very nicely. A little bit of 220 sandpaper to finish that off, and I ended up with a good finish on those 2 long grain edges. Didn't take many passes on those 4 edges to get a nice smooth surface that I would later use a roundover bit on the router to smooth out. So there's the 2 boards kind of ready to go to the router. I have a whole bunch of roundover bits. I ended up using a 1/2 inch radius roundover in my router because I wanted the outside edges of this little hand-sized cutting board to be almost round. In other words, just about halfway through the thickness of the board is the roundover bit. A little shy of that, and you'll see as I'm sanding it that it left maybe a 1/4 inch still flat surface. But once around here with the bit, these bits are fairly sharp. You can see there's a little burning, but absolutely no tear out on the end of that end grain, which was nice to see. So I went around that board, having taped or 2-sided taped the board down to my bench so it wouldn't move on me while I was routing. I turned it over and did the same on the other side. That tape really holds on. put another layer of that on the other side and routed the other side. So put the double-sided tape on the back side. Thought I'd be cheap there and use the piece twice. Not a good idea. Ended up putting another new piece on so it would lay nice and flat. Last thing you want, at least the last thing I want when I'm routing, is for the piece of wood to start scooting around on the table. So double-sided tape really works well for that. Kind of locked it down. I ended up getting a nice rounded edge on this, having routed the top and the bottom. And then later I put it in the vise and actually routed down the short 1-inch length of each corner so that I had basically a 6-sided rounding, and you can see how that finished out. Then I have some beeswax and mineral oil finish, and it's a food grade beeswax and mineral oil. So I applied that liberally with a rag, buffed it with a paper towel. I find that works the best for some reason. It pulls off the what's left of sort of the sticky part of the wax, and yet it acts as a good buffer. So I put a coat on with a rag, buffed it off with a paper towel, put on a second coat with fine steel wool just to take any fuzz off, and then buff that pretty vigorously with a paper towel. And I ended up with a board that has a very nice, very smooth finish, will be food safe. I think will stand up to getting wet now and then, and washed, and then maybe re-oiled or re-waxed somewhere down the line. But it ended up, I think, looking really great, and with just simply beeswax and mineral oil as my finish. Once I'd buffed that with the paper towel, again, I did a second coat with steel wool, second buffing with a paper towel, and I ended up with a board that looks pretty good, made out of scrap, did it all in one day. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe.